Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to yet another episode of The Ways We Move, the podcast that highlights innovative mobility solutions and the people working to bring them to you. And I mean you and me, so that one day we can just tap on our phones and go to wherever we want to go. My name is Nicolas Zart, and I will be your host again today on The Ways We Move. And I have yet again, another special guest because he also is not only someone who is very well known in the industry, also has a lot of experience in aviation, also a military background, just like our other friend Rex Alexander has. And his name is Clint Harper. So usually if you know Rex Alexander, you also have heard about Clint Harper, who is also a great friend of ours and of mine. And I'd like to also say something that I knew as soon as I would record this, that it wouldn't be a one session, that it would come into two parts. So this is part one, and then we'll have part two. And the reason is whenever Clint and I, or even Rex and I talk, we talk for a long time. We always talk for in fact, with Clint, I don't think our conversations are ever under an hour and a half, which is great. So without further ado, we'll let Clint introduce himself. But just to let you know, we're going to be talking about how airports were designed in the US. What was the history behind that, and what was the idea behind that, and what they went through until there was some sort of revival in the 60s and 70s, but how they were challenged by the automotive, and how before that we had the rail industry, and how all of that fits into what we now have, and also now the potential for all of these regional air mobility airports to become AAM, multimodal transportations, or as we like to call it, multi-ports. Clint is really good when it comes to that because he has an urban design background on top of his military background, which is really an airport and running airports, but also scheduling flights and aircraft and everything. So he has a very good understanding. He also has something else, and this is something that is, I don't want to say rare in the industry, but it's very unique to Clint. He also understands the social dynamics and everything that comes with advanced air mobility. I've been watching Clint speak for the last 10 years, if not more, and he's an amazing person, both inside and out, and certainly a fundamental pillar of the advanced air mobility industry, just like Rex Alexander is. And so that's why I'm very excited to have had Rex Alexander and now Clint Harper, because with these two, you really understand a lot about advanced air mobility, specifically when it comes down to infrastructure. So without further ado, let's have Clint introduce himself. And in this part one, we'll talk about all of this, and then stay tuned for part two. True. That will be equally as interesting. Thank you. And again, the call to action is always the same thing. You might have an understanding of what AAM is, advanced air mobility. You might have heard of flying cars, air taxis. What does that mean to you? And especially after you've watched all of this, has it changed your mind? Do you have a better idea? Do you have any ideas? Do you have a better idea to bring us and obviously come to the table and help us with it? This is really for you. Advanced air mobility is meant for all of us to have another mode of mobility or transportation added to everything that we already have right now. Safer, quieter, ideally emission-free. There you go. We'll let Clint introduce himself and talk about the role of airports getting into this advanced air mobility new era. Clint, take it away. All right, Clint. Well, why don't you introduce yourself for those who might not know you? There might be one or two people in the world.
I'm sure there's plenty more than that, but yeah, I'm Clint Harper. I am the founder and principal advisor for Harper 4D Solutions. Sounds real fancy, but I'm just basically a one-man show consulting organization. I've got most of my aviation experience, 27 years, I think, going on now. I've lost count, but most of that's come from the Air Force. I've been very grateful and fortunate enough to have a very diverse career. I started out in aircraft maintenance, transitioned into the airfield management career field within the Air Force. And the airfield management career field is different from what you see on the civilian side. It's a mix of aircraft dispatch and airport operations. And then towards the end of, if you stay in long enough, towards the end of your career, you get more into airport planning. And so it gives you a good mix of different things. I also spent time as a military instructor. I managed and taught the 4 regionally accredited aviation courses for the Community College of the Air Force at Keesler Air Force Base. 3 of those were airfield management courses, and 1 was an airspace management course. And so had just blessed with a long and diverse career with the Air Force. And in 2014, I retired and came over to the civilian side and have been trying to take those talents, and I've paired them with an urban planning degree. I've got new sensitivities and new aspirations, with what I've learned in that program. And I'm doing everything I can to try and make aviation a better industry that serves more people, that's more accessible to more people. And I think that advanced air mobility is a part of that equation in the long run.
That's funny you should say that. You're right. First of all, that's amazing. Thank you for your service for one thing, but that's amazing because you do have a very varied background. And I just remember that the first time I saw you was in Los Angeles at the LA Auto Show, and it was right around 2015 or something like that. So I've been listening to you, my friend, for the last 10 years. And back then I had more hair, by the way. So yes, indeed. But it's one thing that actually I remember about you is how diversified your background is and how much you bring to advanced air mobility. Not only you do have a conventional aviation background and you can operate anywhere. Pretty much right now, you could walk into any airport and work there, but you also understand the future aviation, the future of innovative aviation and what we now call advanced air mobility. So I wanted to pick your brains a little bit of how do you see this whole industry morphing? I mean, 10 years ago, actually, we had a much more naive sense of what it was like. And of course, as technology develops, as we mature, now the infrastructure side of it is much more robust than it was before. What's your take on the evolution of it? And then we'll get into, and I know I'm loading a lot of questions into one here, but then we'll get also into what does it mean for people, all of this? So let's start with how do you see the industry evolving right now?
Yeah, so I think it's probably not a surprise, that aviation, is following the lead of many other transportation modes in exploring an electric future. And I believe that's pretty important. I think diversifying where we're getting our energy from and how we're using our energy is a part of sustainability, is a part of resilience. We haven't had that for the past 100 years. The United States and a lot of parts of the world have put all their eggs into the personal automobile basket. And, from that, there's unintended consequences and intended consequences of all those decisions. And we're starting to learn that not having choice, modal choice, not having a transportation diversity has created some issues, within our communities and just even within our social structure, if I can go that far. And so I'm really happy to see, that we're starting to explore, what an electric aviation industry might look like. That's leading to conversations about other fuel sources such as hydrogen, hybrid technologies, but also not to forget about existing and legacy innovation pathways that we've been down for quite some time, such as sustainable aviation fuel, finding a solution or an alternative for 100 low lead. And all of that, is going to move forward, in creating a diverse industry, that I think is going to create more opportunities for access, more jobs. It's going to maximize the use of our existing infrastructure, create opportunities to develop new infrastructure. And if that new infrastructure and there's way we can start bringing other modes of transportation into the whole mix, I think we're setting ourselves up for, to be resilient for many different situations and things to come.
Absolutely. No, you're totally right. And then I think before we even get to what it means for our society, I think one of the things that I last heard you talk about was how this is all giving some airports a second lease on life and maybe even going back to their original purpose. And for those of you who are watching from Europe, in the US, there was a big push to bring cities together in the 90s, which goes back to what Clint was saying, is that all the eggs went into the automotive basket. And the idea was to link all of the cities in the United States through a network of highways, which, by the way, all things considered, when you get stuck on 405 in LA, think that this was designed 60, 70 years ago. So you have to sort of tip your hat to these guys. It still works horribly, but it still works these days. However, not all cities could be connected to other bigger cities. And so I think what happened after that, and this is what I sort of got from that conversation we were having, is a lot of cities then decided to, why not have airports or open up airfields? And so does this mean that we're going to see a sort of a second life for these airports that were built maybe in the 60s and 70s and never fully matured, or as well as the bigger international ones in big cities? Is that what it means?
It's an interesting question, and so my mind went about 8 different places while you were just kind of setting that up on ways that we can answer this question.
And on purpose.
The first place my mind went to was the original purpose of these airports that were established all over the country. And so the original purpose was actually military training for many of them. And so they were developed and built, outside of urbanized areas because they were there to, train warfighters, military aviation and things of that nature. And then when World War II ended, and things started settling down, we started having some security. It came time for the military and the DoD to divest of that infrastructure and turn it over to the cities or the counties to operate and hopefully turn a profit on it or make it a part of their economic landscape. Because if I remember back then, also the FAA didn't exist. All aviation was
Right.
managed under the Department of Commerce, and
Right.
so from that, the vision of aviation, was very different. So we can look at it's interesting, and I'll use Utah as an example. Most of these small airports that were originally envisioned for military training, they're in cities that were also along older transportation corridors. So if you're familiar with Utah, old Highway 89
Yep.
was the north-south corridor, and there's a lot of airports sprinkled along that corridor itself. You get back into the 60s and 70s, I-15 was developed as the north and south corridor and replaced it. And there's much fewer airports along the I-15 corridor, but there are still a few. And so it's interesting to look at, that history to say, all right, well, what was the original intention of these airports? I think we can say the original vision was for them to be a part of a grander economic strategy to build resiliency and bring aviation, to these communities. So I think that's fair to say. But what do you think?
Mm.
Given that different context, I see you reading your body language there.
I know. I mean, you told me a lot of things I just didn't know. First of all, the Department of Commerce was in charge of all of that. I didn't know that the original idea was the military training, which actually makes a lot of sense and also positions them as perfect entities. And again, going back to the whole idea of the whole highway system that was developed, and of course, some cities were not part of it, just strategically or economically or for whatever reason, it gives them all the opportunity now to become again sort of a mobility hub of sorts. So, and another thing that you said that I thought was brilliant is Utah. Utah was also, if I remember well, that's where the two railroads met, right?
Yeah.
Transcontinental.
The Golden
So the
Spike.
more I think about it, yeah, exactly. So the more I think about it, the more Utah probably stands at the threshold of this multi-port mobility that we're getting into right now. And regional airports might be just the right thing to rekindle that. And then think of all the little communities that are still outside the reach of bigger cities and everything, and they're sort of in their own little pocket. That would open up a lot of things. That would open up opportunities, professional opportunities, cultural. I mean, you name it. So a lot of the things you said made a lot of sense there. So it almost looks like, they're sitting on. I don't want to say the golden goose, but they're the golden goose sitting on something. Put it this way, I guess. That's
Sitting on something. I think that's the right way to do it, because if
Yeah.
you go to
You
some
don't
of
want
these
to.
communities,
Yeah, you don't want to sit on the golden goose. It makes no sense.
well, if you go to these communities, and you talk about this vision, it can be hard for them to wrap their heads around, this
Yeah.
as the opportunity as you just laid it out. It's nice to think about opportunity, and I think most small communities can appreciate that, but how that opportunity actually takes shape, it's very nascent at this point, and so we can look at, um, other previous transportation disruptions, and how that shaped the development of
Mhm.
communities in the past, and we can go way back to, the spice trade route
Yep.
and
Yeah.
how cities
Exactly.
emerged along that, and then when
Yep.
port cities became a big thing, those old spice routes, soon fell out. The big cities and big, bustling trade cities that were along that route, we don't hear
Yep.
much from them anymore. We had all these port cities that were the, the hubs of economic activity, the hubs of culture and all that kind of stuff. And then, with that, we had rail systems, that got developed.
Yep.
And some of those port cities, fell out of favor and more became less important. And these rail cities became the thing. And the city that I'm, just adjacent to right now in Ogden, it was, the rail city in Utah at the time. It's where, multiple rail spurs come together. And so it was seen as the
Wow.
future big city, of it all, and highlighted by the Golden Spike that was just about, maybe about 30 miles north of here, that connected the Transcontinental Railroad
Wow.
was all a part of that. And so they basked in that glory for, maybe about 50 years, if even that. And then the highway came along, and I-15 came and was built through Salt Lake City, and all the
Yep.
economic activity and everything that was envisioned for Ogden shifted 30 miles to the south to Salt Lake. And Ogden, now fell out of favor. Like Ogden used to be a famous rail town. Al Capone, famously visited Ogden and didn't want to walk out of the train station because it was so wild. It was so crazy. And he felt that it was even too dangerous for him to step out onto the streets. And so
Wow.
it had its own little lore and fame and all this kind of stuff. And all that's kind of gone into the past. And I think, that's, you can look at that and say, all right, well, that's what happens when we have these new innovations, and airports,
Yep.
is the next big thing. We can already see that with a lot of places like Dallas Fort Worth area. The Dallas Fort Worth
Hmm.
Metroplex, largely,
Perfect.
is built around the two airports or the airports that exist there. And there's a number of those, throughout the country, but they're also all tied into existing ports. Like, LAX, has the Port of LA, the Port of Long Beach, and then that area. And so I think we can look back at the history and look at how things have integrated in the past, and we have gotten better at it incrementally. But with full view of history, and available,
Yep.
we can start looking at
Yep.
what this looks like, so that we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater with all the other modes of transportation, and figure out how to make this
Yes.
truly multimodal, and truly
Yes.
integrate with everything else that we got going on. And so just because now we have aviation or potentially aviation centric cities doesn't mean that the highway I-15 interstate cities are going to go away. It doesn't mean that the
Yes.
port cities are going to go away. We want to add on to that and take the best of all of them and bring them together to see what comes to be.
I think you hit it on the nail, and that's you're right, because before that we had chariots and horses drawn and everything. Then the steam locomotive came in, that revolutionized everything. But we sort of like gone over and said, all right, well that's the old. Now let's go with the new. And there are rubber wheels on a car on tarmac. That's the new thing. And of course you push that to ad nauseum. It doesn't work anymore, or it doesn't work as well anymore. And now all of a sudden you have the rebirth of aviation. But I think what's different about advanced air mobility right now, and it also goes back to the presentation I've been making the last 2 years. I've said, look, I don't want you to think that AAM is a standalone entity, right? It is part of aviation, and aviation itself is part of mobility. And we really need to wrap our heads around that: multi-port, multi-modalities, multi-mobility, all of these things. So I think right now we're going back to using the original ideas of all these disruptive technologies at the same time that were coming on, and now we're trying to rationalize it into something that makes more sense for everyone. No, that's a very good point you said there. Perhaps there are lots of things that we can learn about how these railways were developed. I mean, were they because they were mining locations around that, touristic sites? I mean, the railroad, we can talk about railroads forever. It's hard to make a dime on the railroad. We saw what happened in the late 60s, early 70s, and the creation of Amtrak, because these companies could not make money bringing people on board. But boy, you can make a lot more money hauling coal, cereal, or Lord knows what into cargo freight trains.
Well,
So that's
we've
an interesting.
divested all we usually what happens is we get excited about this future mode, this future technology, and we divest in everything that
Yep.
we put into other modes and technologies up to that point. And so if you look at any even medium-sized city to large-sized city within the United States, back in the 30s, they had very robust rail networks, commuter and light rail lines that would be the envy
Yes.
of any major city in the
Yes.
world. And
Yes.
when the automobiles started gaining favor of that, we're like, all right, well, we need to
Yes.
get rid of all these rail lines, cover them up, and make way for roadways so that we can have cars and all that kind of stuff. And yeah, and you look at like a map of LA or even Salt Lake City, there were trolley lines, scattered throughout all
Yes.
the main corridors in Salt Lake City that I know lawmakers and folks would love to have back, right now.
Yes. Actually, you mentioned Long Beach. I lived in Long Beach for 17 years, and the red line used to go from LA all the way down to Seal Beach. And you can still go in Seal Beach, probably still to this day. There is a caboose out there, and you can see how it worked and everything. And another thing that you would notice in Long Beach is I've always driven small European cars. I could fit in the garage fairly well. There's no way in the world you can fit an SUV or a pickup truck because they were meant for, well, they weren't even meant for any cars. It was, usually a carriage and that's about it. And these houses were built for people typically from Wisconsin, Illinois, who would come down in the summer and spend some time at the beach. They would get out at Union Station in LA downtown and then take that red car and go all the way down to Long Beach and then just get out and spend 2-3 months. Back then, when you had 2-3 months worth of vacation in the summer, not for everybody, of course, but for a lot of people. So, yeah, I think
Of how a transportation mode, has impacted our built environment. So if you
yes,
go look at these houses that were built in the 40s and 50s, and even into the 60s, many of them have a single car garage, and
yep,
that garage is smaller, is tight. Especially if you look at the size of cars today, they're like, all right, well, this is only good for storage now. As you get into the 70s and 80s, and even especially in the 90s, if you look at the front of a house from the 50s, the garage is very minor. Sometimes it's even just a carport, but the rest of
yep.
the house, what the humans use is what you see most of. If you get into houses that were built through the 90s and you look at the front, most of it is garage. So it shows the shifting of our priorities, from a human centric environment to a car centric environment. Interesting to see, if we have learned from these lessons of the past and we're going to start developing, more with more mode choice, more diversity into this, what that environment can look like in the future. And not saying, we're going to see vertiports and driveways. Not saying we won't, but that's a
Yeah.
that's a
I mean,
longer conversation. But we're a long ways from that right now. But if we're less reliant on a personal automobile, and
right.
I live in a neighborhood right now where most of my neighbors, have transitioned from 2-car garages to 3 or 4-car garages. So how much better can we think of utilizing that space if it's not, if we're not building so much of the properties that we're paying for on our transportation? Can we build better? Are there other opportunities to use that? Do we need other facilities in our houses of the future? It's interesting.
Yeah, and we're definitely at a plateau right now. It's hard to push more cars out. I think Porsche in 2015 publicly said, it's getting harder and harder to make money on cars. That's why we're getting into the aviation industry. And I thought, wow, if the Germans are saying that, that there's a little problem somewhere along the lines here. So, yeah, I think that's the one thing about AAM that really stands out. It really is a unifying factor. It's now when we think of, even a vertiport, but mostly multi-ports, any kind of bigger infrastructure, we're thinking about, okay, well, these charging stations have to also charge cars and eventually might have to charge electric buses. And where do we place them and how can we extend them? And not only that, but they need to charge electric airplanes, which notoriously are going to draw a lot of amperage, but eVTOLs, but drones, but the ground vehicles, and of course the actual buildings themselves, and power the almighty AI that needs to be powered, ever hungry AI kind of thing.
Yeah.
So it really is a multiple approach. And it's funny because 2 years ago I raised a lot of eyebrows in a talk because I said, you're whether you're designing a vertiport or a multiport, whatever you want to call them, you're not just a mobility platform anymore. You're a lifestyle platform, and you're mostly an energy platform or an energy hub. And people are like, it's like you're storing energy, you're storing electricity. Potentially, you can resell it. Not that utilities will want you to do that, but you really have to extend and really stretch your mind out. It's not a bus stop. It's not a harbor. It's not an airport. It's way bigger than that. It is truly an
Yeah.
all-encompassing, holistic mobility solution. I don't know how else to call it.
A story, that it kind of resonates with that. And it's in a classroom, and they had this guest lecturer come into the classroom to talk to these business students. And they said, all right, what kind of company is McDonald's? And, obviously they're all like, well, it's a fast food company. It's a restaurant company. It's all around food. And the speaker was like, no, McDonald's is a real estate company.
It's a real estate franchise company. Absolutely, yeah.
Because the real estate is where the real value is at in all this. And so it kind of drives you to force to think a little bit differently. What is, an airport? What is a heliport? And I think with many of the heliports, that I've worked with, they struggle, especially during like harder economic times and things of that nature. It's hard to get by. It's hard to make the ends meet. It's hard to pay those bills. So airports, have solved that problem to an extent. Not, I shouldn't say solved. They've been working on the problem. If you look at what is the biggest source of revenue for an airport, it's usually not the aviation operations. A large international airport, its biggest source of revenue is parking. All right.
Parking, real estate.
Yeah, and it could be the real estate aspect of it, but it's not the aviation operations. It supports, it's there. But so how does that inspire us to think differently about future infrastructure? And I've been talking about this to different groups as I've been trying to, among others, I won't say I'm the first one to think of this, but the concept of a resiliency hub. So when
Yeah.
I talk to folks in Utah, during my role as a state airport system planner, I would go out and talk to communities and say, "What do you think about your airports?" And more than 9 times out of 10, the feedback that I would get was, "Oh, well, we don't like the airport. It's noisy. It's polluting. We have to deal with the noise and the emissions at the expense of not having access to any of it. So it's a playground for the wealthy that doesn't do us any good." And so we would take that feedback back and like, yeah, that's not a great outlook, for the
Nope.
future of our airports. And the airports would come back and say, we're economic generators, and you hear that a lot within the aviation industry. An airport is an economic generator. And so how do we quantify that? Well, most states will do an economic impact study. And so that's what we embarked on. We embarked on an economic impact study. And we did learn some lessons from the past. And so I did have some correspondence from the last time an economic impact study was run. And it really reads like it was discredited about 2 weeks after it was published because they were going for the biggest bang. They wanted to figure out what was the maximum that these airports do. And if you know anything about economic impact studies, you have to make assumptions at some point, in doing those.
Of
And you can
course.
choose to make those assumptions on the conservative side or on the outlandish side. And it really seems like the assumptions were made on the outlandish sides for this previous report, and people saw right through that and were able to discredit it pretty quickly. And so we went through, we did the economic impact studies. We really, spent a lot of time with our consultant to try and reduce assumptions. But where we did have to make assumptions, we always leaned on the conservative side. And so when we got those numbers back
Makes
for each of the
sense.
airports, we went back out and talked to the communities. And for the most part, they were like, we like this. We don't want the jobs to go away. We appreciate, that we didn't know this about the airport. And so, we're grateful
Of
that we
course.
now know a little bit more about the airport. Could we not generate this same economic impact? If it's just a number at the end of the day, could we not generate this same economic impact by developing apartments or strip mall, or whatever it is, on that property instead of the airport? And then we still have the economic impact, but we wouldn't have to deal with the noise and the emissions. And so it was
Bingo.
back to the drawing board for us. And
Yep.
at that time, FEMA had came to Utah, and we're getting ready to do a large exercise with the state. And so we had all the state organizations with FEMA in a room, and we started scenario planning around what would I think it was a 7.0 earthquake look like during the morning rush hour in downtown Salt Lake City. And so
Wow.
we scenario planned this out to say, all right, well, we already know liquefaction is a huge issue in Salt Lake. A lot of the buildings aren't, up to date and surviving that kind of earthquake. And so they just started coming up with it. All right, roads are going to be just out, bridges are going to be out, hospitals are going to be inundated, all these things. And then what we also learned is that a lot of hospitals have transitioned, for their supplying needs. They've all transitioned to a hub and spoke method of getting all the supplies to the hospitals. And of course, when all the bridges are out, now you have
Ooh.
points of failure that have revealed themselves when some of the most critical aspects of a response, in such an event. We're going to have all our hospitals inundated with patients that are hurt and ailing and need attention, but we're not going to be able to get the equipment to them or
Nope.
the supplies to them to help because our transportation infrastructure has been compromised. And so from that regard, we learned that aviation shines, where the railways and the roadways, might be difficult getting supplies in and out. Most of the airports responded back. It's like, yeah, we might be compromised, but we're not going to close down. We're still going to be able to support military, supported operations, disaster relief, all that kind of stuff. We're going to be up and running far faster than anybody else is. And so the resiliency component, really shined for aviation on that. And we added that back into our outreach and says, all right, your airport isn't just an economic generator. We quantified that for you, but you had
Good.
ideas that you can achieve similar results with other developments. But what about this resiliency aspect? And that opened a lot of people's eyes to see that, oh, well, the airport really needs to be there for resiliency. We may not
Good.
like it. We may not agree with who's using it, when it's not in that resiliency capacity, but we
Right.
don't want to lose that, and so and just in the years following, we had wildfires, where firefighters were based out of airports, supporting the wildfire response. The communities, appreciated that and supported that in full force. And then in 2020, we had an earthquake in downtown Salt Lake City. It was a I think it was low 6.0 type of earthquake. It didn't. Fortunately, it didn't bring all the worst case scenario that we were planning for, but it
Good.
also did highlight, when there was uncertainty
Yep.
on the transportation infrastructure and was it going to be ready, for the worst case, the airports all refunded back in the real world saying, we're ready. If you need to bring flights in for whatever, we're ready. And again, it highlighted that resiliency component. Going back to what we talked about, what are airports? Are they
Yep.
real estate? Are
Yep.
they aviation
Yep.
facilities? They're resiliency. They're hubs for resiliency within a community. And if we can learn that and prove that out with airports, then
Yep.
we can scale that down to an extent with vertiports, drone ports, whatever it might be, whatever the future is bringing on the infrastructure side. Number one, it should be a resiliency hub. And then it can support, the day-to-day stuff, but if it's there to support, supplies, emergency command centers, whatever it might be, um, you know, then we could say, all right, well, in the meantime, when we're not responding to an emergency, we'll use it for logistics, we'll use it for passenger travel, we'll use it for whatever, because that's going to pay the
Emergencies.
bills to make sure that it's available when the time comes.